Namaste.
Yes.
I'm Dimple, the Director of Academic Programs at INDICA, and I welcome you all to the latest session of our overview webinar series. At INDICA, we strive to create and curate offerings that delve into various aspects of Indigenous knowledge systems to fulfill our mission of sharing the transformative power of timeless Indigenous wisdom with lifelong learners and seekers. I urge you to visit indica.courses and look at the various offerings that we have there and feel free to enroll, gift, or recommend various offerings that are available there. The overview webinar series, as some of you might be aware of, serves as a sort of a platform wherein we provide you with a detailed understanding of what an upcoming Indica course has to offer, thereby helping you make an informed enrollment decision. So this evening's webinar is focused on our upcoming Indica course, Understanding Cultures, a comparative study of Indic and Western paradigms, that delves into the Comparative Cultural Research program pioneered by Professor S.N. Balagangadhara at Ghent University. It is designed to equip participants with a profound understanding of how cultural narratives are shaped and perceived, particularly through the lens of social science research. By contrasting Western and Indic cultural paradigms, the course will challenge the participants to critically examine the historical research, colonial influences, and the ways in which cultures are understood and represented. The course begins on the 17th of October 2024 with live sessions every Thursday from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. IST. We are so honored to have today with us our faculty member, Arvind Kaushik ji, who will take you through the course details in a bit. But before I invite him to do so, here's a brief introduction about Arvind Kaushik ji. He is a scholar affiliated with the research program Comparative Science of Cultures developed by Professor S.N. Balagangadhara at Ghent University. He holds a PhD from the University of Pardubice, Czech Republic. As part of the Erasmus Student Exchange Program, he spent time at Ghent University in Belgium, conducting research for a paper he's currently working on. Arvindji has since returned to his birth country, India, where he continues to pursue his academic and research interests. Though he is based in India, but currently he's joining us from Canada, and I'm really grateful to him for taking time out so early in the morning to share with us the details of his upcoming course. So Arvindji, welcome to this evening's webinar. It's all yours now.
Namaste. Namaste, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I'm eager to be part of this and get the course started. So thank you for everyone who enrolled in this course, who are joining us in this course. Thank you very much. And I hope this journey will be enjoyable for all of us. So let's get started. As Dimple just introduced, this is a course about understanding cultures, both Indian and Western. It's called Comparative Study of Indic and Western Paradigms. So basically, as Dimple said, I came through the research program of Professor S.N. Balagangadhara. It is called the official name of the research program is Comparative Science of Cultures. In Dutch, it's called Cultuurwetenschap, Comparative Science of Cultures. It studies uh, Western culture against the backdrop of Indian culture. So this course, even though it's about studying Indian and Western culture, it is more geared towards the how of learning, the how of research. So um, more so than giving you information, giving you knowledge about Indian culture, I'm hoping this will teach you the how of research and the process of research also, and the methodology of this specific research program, so that you guys who are students of this course will then be able to, if you're interested in doing research, take what you've learned and apply it into doing the actual research. So that's what I'm hoping will be the outcome of this course. And all right, so next. So as Indians or Indics, whatever you want to say, we are at a crossroads now in 21st century India, especially at this time in 2024. So in this slide, you see a cover of a book which is just some years back published in Indica itself, written by the director of my research program, Professor S.N. Balagangadhara. What does it mean to be Indian? That's the title of the book. But this question itself is very important because each one of us, we're all grappling. We're all grappling with the question of who are we? What does it mean to be Indian? And we've been asking this question, I mean, for a long time. This is not a new question. This question, this crisis of what does it mean to be an Indian started way back, even during British colonialism in 19th century. Many scholars were asking the same question. Um, Post-independence, some people are asking it, but now it is more and more people are exploring it. It has become like a culture-wide phenomenon. There's something you can feel it happening in the background where we want to get back to, what is our culture? What is our place in the world? Like, what is India's place in the world? What do we have to offer? You know, not only who are we, what do we have to offer in this world? And this is not, we're not talking about India, the country, but who are we as a culture and who do we have to what do you have to offer? And as you know, like I'm sure many scholars, and you see it in many documentaries, it's become a cliche now. India is very diverse. There are all kinds of people from all sorts of religious background. What makes all of us Indian? What makes the Assamese Christian and Indian? What makes an Assamese Christian and like a Tamil Brahmin, for instance, are both of them Indian? Are both of them part of the same cultural fabric? Can something be called an Indian culture? Or as many of regional parties argue, there's no such thing as Indian culture. There's Tamil culture. There's Bengali culture. So that's the question we are all grappling with. And as Professor Balu says, this is not just idle like identity politics that is being sold in like US and Chicago, like who are we? We have to get back to roots, and each group is fighting for its identity in US. We want to be recognized as this community, that community, and what is our roots. This is a deeper question of like we're trying to figure out who we are as a culture, as I said. So in and then who we are, what do we have to offer, then that becomes a very important question. What do we have to offer? And this thing to figure that out, we have to figure out what our intellectuals were doing in the past for thousands of years, like whom we call our acharyas, intellectuals, teachers. What were they doing for thousands of years? And that is a multi-generational task. And for that, that is why we need systematic research, because we can't just say, it's very beautiful to say, we were pondering about the deepest mysteries of life and our acharyas were doing that. It sounds very good, sounds very romantic, but to get taken seriously in the rest of the world, we need to put the insights of our acharyas in a very modern scientific language based on very systematic research. So that is what the task of the generation of Indian intellectuals today and also tomorrow. So that is going to be very important. And the other question is, as of now, we're not at that stage, because when you ask what does India have to offer, or what does the West have to learn from India, and there's no satisfactory answers in the books we have to read. I mean, you get fragments of answers. You get something like Ayurveda, yoga, Vedantic philosophy. You get individual things. Whereas when you ask the opposite, what does other cultures have to learn from the West? What do we have to learn from the West? We don't just get things about individual things. We don't just get nuclear physics or mac and cheese or pizza. We don't get these answers. When we say learning from the West, we mean learning from the West as the Western way of going about in the world. Like how do they do things? And it's a very broad ranging question, like what is the Western way of going about? And it's not just one or two or three things. Western culture is presented as an alternative to the Indian way of going about. And yet the reverse, nobody asks, nobody even ponders in the West. Like, can India or China uh, be an alternative? The Chinese culture, Indian culture, be an alternative to Western culture. Nobody even takes that in a serious way. So that is what we need to ask. So that is this thing. That is the goal of today. And for that, social science research, doing good research is very important. And I will get to what that research means, what we need to do in the humanities, social sciences. So only when we know, figure out that question, what does it mean to be Indian, who we are, what we have to offer, then we have a clear idea of our goals as a people. Do we want to be a superpower? Do we want to be a Vishwaguru? Because these terms also get mentioned often, superpower, Vishwaguru. And can we be both, or are these two goals contradictory? Because we are still grappling with it. Like, we want to go back to our roots in a lot of ways, and we want to protect our connection to nature, environment. At the same time, we also want to be developed. We want to develop into a world power which is taken seriously. So that's it. Can we do all three at once, or do we have to choose one? What does it mean? So that is a question for the future. So next. So, anyways, I'll delve more into the research program I've come through, been part of, studied under for the last 6, 7 years. So, yes, this research program was started by Professor S.N. Balagangadhara. He lives in Ghent, and his background story itself is very interesting, and I think it is worth briefly going over it here in order to understand where this research program, how he started this research program. So, Professor Balagangadhara, or Balu as we call him fondly, he was originally from Bangalore. He was born into a very orthodox Sanketi Brahmin family in Bangalore. And he had a very orthodox upbringing. He learned Sanskrit. He was chanting Veda, Bhagavad Gita from a very young age. Then, for reasons I won't get into, at age 18, he rebelled against all that. He left home. He became a Marxist revolutionary. He thought, this thing, all these religions, all these orthodoxies, they're all superstition, and he wanted to do a revolution, but of course in a non-violent way. He left home, and eventually he wound up in Belgium. He got a scholarship to study there. He wanted to go to Belgium and study with other Marxists, learn more about Marxism as an ideology. And when he went to Belgium, he made it a point only to move around with the white Europeans. He didn't form in Indian ghettos. Like, when Indians go abroad, they tend to commingle with other Indians and not with the local populace that much. So his friends, his close friends, everyone was European. And only when he's moving around with them 24 hours a day with Westerners, Europeans, then he experienced culture shock, and he discovered that cultural differences are not just trivial things like, wearing a kurta or eating spicy food compared to, eating bland food. It went for way deeper than that. It goes into how we even think of each other as a human being, like how Indians think of what is human beings, human life is very different from what people from other cultures think, including Western culture. And then he started delving into social sciences, and he became very dissatisfied with what the social science books say about Indian culture. He found that it's not giving us any knowledge about our own culture. The reason is, it doesn't make sense of our experience. When we as Indians read these books written by Western scholars about Indian culture, nowhere does it address our experience of our own culture. It seems that Westerners are just describing to Balu, and he was right, their experience of Indian culture. So that's where this research program was born. So, and then he did, that's when him and many other scholars in the 60s and 70s, they started discovering that Indology itself was built from colonialism. When the British colonized us, they started engaging in massive knowledge production enterprise. They wanted to understand the colonized everyone so that they can, better to rule over us, control us. But in the process, as I said before, those descriptions don't give us any knowledge about Indian culture. And in fact, studying those descriptions will tell us more about Western culture and how they experience other cultures. So this answers the question of this. Now we come to the question of why understand the Western culture itself. So, and that is because of the phenomenon of colonialism. And we have to understand that for past 200, 300 years, we have been under British colonialism, some form of European British colonialism, and thanks to their educational system, their descriptions and their concepts have we have started using it for generations. This didn't just start in my generation or the previous generation. For 3, 4 generations, their concepts, their description of India, we have adopted it, whether consciously or unconsciously. Their concepts, their this thing. We've started using that to make sense of our culture, and even our government policies, laws, legal system, everything is a continuation of the colonial institution. So in order to get so Balu calls this as colonial consciousness. We are in a state where we are unable to access our own experience of our culture. We are just repeating another culture's experience of our culture. So this thing. So this Western culture's description of other cultures is what this scholar named Edward Said, he coined the term Orientalism. Orientalism, he says, is the phenomenon of Western culture studying and describing other cultures. And what he says is this Orient that the West describes is not the real Orient, but is the construction of the West. Just as when they talk about India, it's not the real India, but it's a constructed India which exists in the imagination of the Westerners. So, in order to understand Orientalism, to get out of this colonial consciousness, as Balu says, we need to understand Western culture. Only then we will understand why they described our culture the way they did, and we will understand why the concepts that we're using do not make sense. And then we will start to access our culture, our experience with our own eyes. So, this was the impetus behind this research program. So, now I will go into some personal reflections, what I have learned over the past 6 years, since studying as a doctoral student in Czech Republic, as well as doing an internship in Belgium. So these personal reflections started during a conversation I had with Jacob de Roer, one of Professor Balagangadhara's students, and he was my mentor, supervisor in Belgium. We started talking about Marx one day in our office, in the university office. We started having a conversation about Karl Marx and his intellectual contribution. And then I admitted very embarrassingly that actually I hadn't read much of Marx at all. I've just read parts of the Communist Manifesto. Then Jacob, to my surprise, he told me, don't bother reading Marx, not only Marx, any other philosopher, just for the sake of reading it. You approach these scholars with questions in mind, with specific research problems, research questions in mind, and then you explore scholars based on research questions, based on something you want to figure out. You don't just read them for reading's sake. And that made a very big impact on me. And I discovered that erudition is not the same as knowledge. And basically, erudition is you are very well read. You know a lot of books, you know a lot of information, and that makes someone knowledgeable. And that is commonly understood as knowledge. But being well read is not the same as knowledgeable. Being knowledgeable is figuring out how something works. That's how scientific knowledge works. Like they study the empirical world and they figure out how something works, its structure, why something is the way it is. It helps us understand something. Knowledge helps us understand why things are the way they are. Information doesn't do that. Like facts don't do that. Like for example, a fact is the leaves are green. When you look at a leaf, it's green. But we don't. That doesn't explain why it is green. So a leaf being green is a fact, but it's not knowledge. Anyways, it's a complex topic. I'll move on. So before going into the research program, I did my bachelor's in psychology at York University in Toronto, in Canada. And I grew very disillusioned with Western psychology. I found that it is not, it doesn't help me understand. I felt very disconnected. What they were teaching about human psychology, the individual, and individual development, how the individual becomes a person, and you might have some of you might have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like you go into the basic needs and the food sustenance, and then you go into friendship socialization needs, and then you go into the final stage, self-actualization, where you become a whole human being. uh, all of these psychological theories are focused on you as an individual person. Each of us are unique individual people, and to cultivate the individual. And this is very different from our experience as Indians, how we are raised as Indians in Indian families and all that. It's a completely different experience. So I grew very disillusioned with Western psychology. I found Freud young very interesting. But as you go on in Western psychology, it just becomes about very boring statistics, this thing, statistics, like how many people feel like this about this issue, and what does that say about their political leanings, something like that. So I grew very disillusioned with Western psychology. And then what happened was this thing during my time in I discovered Balu's research program that brought me back my love of knowledge, because studying in York University, doing my undergraduate in psychology, it brought disillusionment, and it made me not want to do research, not want to seek knowledge. But discovering Professor Balu's research program, that brought me back to knowledge. And during the time I studied in Czech Republic, I learned the research process. And one of the first thing I learned, the first step in taking up any research, writing an article, writing a dissertation, is having a research problem. That is the first step, having a research question or having a research problem. So, and that's what I learned. And that in the initial stage, that is the most important and most difficult step, because for research you have to be very specialized. When you're doing research about any topic, you have to get as specialized, narrow the search space as much as possible, narrow down your research problem. And it's not just one question or one problem. There'll be one major problem which you're trying to solve, one question, and from that sub questions, sub problems come up. And then this thing, you have to read, you have to look into the books, do research in order to solve these problems. And when looking into the book, before I got into my PhD research, I used to passively read books, like about a topic. I would read books, take notes from books, all that. It was during this my research in Czech Republic that I learned this process, which has been since time immemorial been in Indian culture, neti process, which the acharyas used to distinguish between what is knowledge, what is not knowledge. Like many of our acharyas use this to get the Brahmanyana, like what is Brahman? It's not this, it is not this, it is not this. Shankaracharya, that's what he did. So that's what I started learning in the research. When you're looking through books, when you're looking through material, the focus is always on the problem. So you learn to look for information, look for ideas which directly pertain, is relevant to your research problem, and discard what is not. And figuring out what is relevant to your research problem, discarding what is not, that is a big learning process. That is almost half of the problem of doing research. So that process, even we have a term in Sanskrit, viveka, the what we say, discrimination. And that's what I learned. Learning what is relevant to get knowledge, which will take me towards knowledge, and what is not relevant towards knowledge. So neti neti and viveka go very much hand in hand, they go together. And then the other thing I learned was the goal of scientific research. So the goal of research is basically to develop hypotheses and theories. Ultimately, you ask a question, you ask problem, you try to solve problem. I mean, you can never completely solve a problem, but you get closer as much as possible to solving problems and opening up new research questions. But any good research should open up new research questions. And in the process, you start developing hypotheses, you start developing theories. That's what they do in the hard sciences, in the natural sciences. So that's it. And then yeah, that's how I learned how to do research. So then I spoke before about social sciences, about the dissatisfaction with social science. So uh, Western scholars, as I said, they just reproduced their experience of India as descriptions of India. But what is disappointing is Indian social scientists, for the most part, have merely reproduced what the West has said about India. They've just embroidered it a little differently. But most of them have not changed. Whether they are saying, and this is very important for the student, whether they are saying positive things about Indian culture or negative things about Indian culture, they are still reproducing Western scholars. Like, for example, I find many of the Indian scholars who say, the greatness of the Vedas, they're talking about it was, the cradle of our civilization. Some scholars say they are actually reproducing Max Muller, because Frederick Max Muller also, William Jones also had many positive things to say about India. Like it's a cradle of civilization. The Vedas is the repository of spirituality, religion. That's what they said. But even if they're saying good things about India, they're not producing knowledge about India. So that is a very important thing to say. So the Indian scholars pretty much they reproduce what the Western scholars say about India. And the other thing I discovered was that since in this has happened in the West and it followed in India since the end of the Second World War, because of the Cold War and other political developments, social sciences became less about knowledge and more about ideology. So it became a fighting game between the left wing, left leaning scholars, right leaning scholars. So whichever ideology you lean on, you produce narratives about the other cultures based on whichever ideology you lean on. So as a result, you are just doing ideology, you're not doing knowledge. So it doesn't. So what you end up doing is producing ad hoc explanations. Like I'll give you an example. Like many scholars, everyone would agree. Most people, there's a virtual consensus that India has and did have in the past also a caste system. We have it today. We have it in the past. So this thing. That's a consensus in among in the social sciences and even in among the general public in general, in both in India and abroad. But when you start asking these scholars very fundamental logical questions, like how did this caste system start? They would say like, you Brahmins started it, they imposed it. And then if you ask them, how did Brahmins start this caste system? How are they able to impose this social religious system on the whole Indian populace? How are they able to do it? Since there is no evidence of like a centralized organization in ancient India, like a church or even a centralized state imposing it from all the way from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, this caste system. So if that is not there, then how did the caste system develop? I'm not denying or confirming existence of caste system, but these questions are very important and they are not answering. They come up with ad hoc explanations. Like ad hoc explanations means they're not scientific. You just come up with it on the spot. So they say, oh, Brahmins were very cunning. They fooled the kings, and the kings forced the population to follow Manusmriti. So this is just made up explanations. I mean, there's no proof, there's no evidence of any of this. So this is what is ad hoc explanations. And unfortunately, most sciences, social sciences, built on ad hoc explanations. And this word narrative, yes, it's thrown around a lot, but the goal of research is not to produce narrative; it's to produce knowledge. Knowledge is different from narrative. Narratives can be important when you're, when in politics and when you're trying to present yourself. Narratives can be important, but the goal of research is to produce knowledge, not narrative. And now we come to another important topic. Is Sanskrit the key to understanding our culture? So many people now they're saying that to do research you need a very good background in Sanskrit to access the texts, our ancient texts, in order to understand our culture. So let me explore this a little bit more. So let me begin with a thought experiment. So imagine that you're trying to teach somebody like X with no knowledge of either biology or English about the theory of photosynthesis. So, what would you need to do? First, you need to teach him the English language. That is the first step. He needs to understand the English language. And then you need to teach him about the theory of photosynthesis. So, there are two levels of problems. So, first, you have to learn the language and then the theory. But learning the language alone would not be enough. I'm sure most of you would agree. To understand photosynthesis, learning English language alone is not enough. Like terminology, there's a lot of technical terminology concepts like photolysis, ATP synthase, these kind of terms. And these terms play a very specific role within the theory of photosynthesis. So, and one cannot understand these terms or the theory by opening up English Oxford Dictionary, like and looking up ATP synthase, this thing photolysis. You cannot open up Oxford Dictionary and understand these concepts. One needs scientific training. One needs to understand the underlying structure of, the biological theory, uh, photosynthesis theory, and in order to truly understand terms like photolysis. Similarly, it's useful to think of Sanskrit texts like Bhagavad Gita and Upanishads as scientific texts about human psychology, human nature, produced by our acharyas. So Sanskrit words like dukkha, dharma, ananda, these are all technical terms within their theories about the human experience, human nature. So one needs training to understand. Like if one learns Sanskrit and one has access to the Monier-Williams dictionary, one does not understand these words. Having a very thorough knowledge of Sanskrit does not mean you can now you're ready to understand the texts. Just reading these texts doesn't mean you'll understand them, because if that was the case, then the Christian missionaries would be experts on Indian culture. Many listeners now may not realize they studied Sanskrit very thoroughly. The rigor and discipline many missionaries spent in learning not only Sanskrit, the local languages, because they had to learn it in order to spread their religion, to spread their word. So they learned Sanskrit. They studied so many of our texts, even more than the local population. The Christian missionaries and studied a lot of our Puranas, Vedas, Upanishads. They studied it because they wanted to debate. They wanted to debate with the local pundits in order to show that their religion, Christianity, is a true religion. But does that mean they really understood these texts just because they were very well versed in Sanskrit? Even Max Muller, he knew Sanskrit, he was very well versed in the language, but that doesn't mean he understood these texts. So, um, one problem we face in accessing our texts, our Sanskrit texts today, even those of us who know Sanskrit, is that because of 800 years of colonialism. So I'll get into this later probably, but colonialism is not just the British. We are also under Islamic colonialism, the Mughal rule, Sultanate rule. Balu considers that not just as a conquest or a rule, that is also a form of colonialism. So, because of 800 years of colonialism, we have become disconnected from the Sanskrit concepts. They no longer are part of our daily experience. We cannot reflect upon them the way our ancestors could reflect upon them. How these concepts like dharma, dukkha, anubhava, avamana, all these concepts, how they connect to each other in our theories, in our philosophies, whether it's Adhyatmak philosophy or Sankhya, Yoga, Advaita, whatever the philosophy, the individual concepts, their connection, how they explain the philosophy, we don't understand right now. So, in addition to that, when the British colonized us, the education system they implemented, uh, they imposed on us, that has created further disconnection from our knowledge system. So I will explain how there are two levels of problems. I will explain what they are. So when as I told you, missionaries began to learn Sanskrit. They began to look for Sanskrit words to translate their Christian theological terminology, like God, like the devil, like law, sin. All these terms they assumed that we also had a religion, like a false religion, but like a religion nonetheless, which would have these terms, like equivalent of these terms: God, sin, this thing, law, doctrine, all these things. So, for example, they started to look for Sanskrit terms. They thought Bhagwan, for example, was the word for God, Sanskrit word for God, and Atman, they thought was the Sanskrit word for soul. So, and so on and so forth. So when Indians learnt English in many of the convent schools, Christian mission schools, and all that, they learnt theological terminology through words in Sanskrit. So they learnt English language through their native vernacular terms, but these vernacular terms had already been mapped onto theological terms. So they learned God means Bhagwan. They thought it was Bhagwan. So that's how we learned. So there's problems that come to the fore. First of all, there's the problem of the translatability of Christian theological concepts into Sanskrit language. So there's a question of even are there Indian equivalents of words like God, soul, evil? Are there Indian terms for this? And these terms, God, soul, evil, have become part of the English language for centuries. They've become part of the everyday English language because English language developed alongside European English culture, which has been a Christian culture for many centuries. So, through the centuries, Christian terminology has become part of the everyday world, the common sense experience of the English speakers. So it is these terms are naturally they understand them. It is part of their everyday experience. Just as when we say manas, it is part of our daily experience. Like we use it in our everyday language. Avamana. It's part of our language. When you say avamana, everyone who's Indian immediately emotionally they connect to it, they can experience it. Same for Westerners when they hear God, soul, evil, these kind of things. For us, it's not the case. So Christian vocabulary has become part of natural language use in European languages. So there's the background Christian framework guides the use of these terms like God, soul, evil. This background Christian framework is not there in India. We're not a Christian culture. So we don't know how to use these terms, God, soul, evil. We learn these terms through Indian translation of Indian concepts. So the Sanskrit language has developed over millennia in a different culture. So because of this problem, a second problem comes. If it is the case that the Sanskrit words used by missionaries do not uh, capture the meaning of the Christian theological terminologies, then it follows that even us as Indian intellectuals wouldn't have been able to make sense of these words that we use even day, every day. God, soul, evil, sin. We say papa means sin, but I don't think we even know what sin means. Yeah. So they wouldn't have been able to make sense of these English theological concepts. So, and because of this problem, second problem, we come to the third problem. So when Indian intellectuals use Sanskrit words to translate theological concepts like Deva equals God, and it is not simply, you might say, so what? We still understand our culture. We are just using a different word. Like we're just using God, but what I mean is Deva. I can still access the Sanskrit concepts. I'm just, instead of using the word Deva, I'm using the word God. There's no harm done. We can still understand our texts and our culture. But the problem is translating Deva as God is not the same as translating water as like Pani or water as Jala, Jala in Sanskrit. These are not, everyday things that are universal to every culture, because God is only there, this concept is only there, as I said, in Christian culture. So these word God comes with a whole bunch of theological baggage, centuries of theological thought about what God is, what are the properties of God. All that comes with this concept. So unconsciously, when we start using this thing, God to translate Bhagavan or vice versa, these Christian theological concepts get smuggled into the Indian vocabulary. So they distort the Indian, our concept also, the Indian understanding, like our understanding of our own concepts. So we end up getting very distorted picture of our own culture. So the end result is we neither understand our culture nor do we understand the Western culture. Both are kind of this thing opaque to us. So next, so before I go further, this thing. So that is why this research is very important, and even more why a comparative research program where we study one culture against the backdrop of another culture is very important for understanding our own culture. So now I'll give a very brief overview of the course. So in the website, you might have seen it already. This is a course overview of the syllabus. So the first class, which will be next week, I will start talking about, we'll get back to the basics. I won't start getting into Indian culture, the comparative science culture research program itself, but instead I will give you basics of like philosophy of science, so that you understand the students get a basic understanding of what is science, what is research. Then I move into the topic of historiography, because this has become a very hot button topic recently. Many Indic scholars are saying that the leftist scholars and the Orientalists, the European scholars, have given a wrong, distorted, false understanding of history. We need to go back and access our true history. And the study of history is historiography, as you all know, obviously. So this next topic after philosophy, historiography will ask how much does historiography help us in understanding the past? Does it really give us knowledge? Does historiography, study of history, give us knowledge about our past? Is that the only way of accessing the past? So, and then part of that is I discuss stories like Puranas, Itihasas. Are these history? Are these stories? Uh, do these help us? How do these Itihasas, Puranas help us access our past? And then I get into this thing. Next topic will be Orientalism and study of Western culture. So, as I discussed before, Orientalism describes the body of knowledge that the West has produced about other cultures, and we will examine the nature of the Western knowledge production, their texts, everything, and what does that tell us about the culture that produced them, because that is where the Orientalist texts are useful. If you take them as texts to understand Indian culture or even other cultures which the West has written about, then they are worthless. They are useless. You can toss them aside. But they're still useful to understand the culture which produced them. That is where the useful. Next, I get into a controversial topic with colonial consciousness, understanding its impact, and there's still a debate. There's no consensus even among scholars in our research program, Comparative Science of Cultures. There is a lot of debate going on with how deeply has colonialism impacted how we relate to our own culture, how we practice our traditions, uh, and what is the problem with it. Just because we adapt certain practices from Christianity or practices from Islam, how does it block us from accessing our own culture? That will be some of the things which are discussed. And then we go into another controversial topic which dominates discussion about India, especially for outsiders. When they say India, you think of caste system, this thing. So uh, we will discuss this more. The research program or the latest research on the caste system, and I'll be relying heavily on this book called The Western Foundations of Caste System, written by a group of scholars from this Comparative Science of Cultures program. So, and the material you'll need for this course, it's listed on the website also, so you can follow along with that. And then I go into the next topic, a hot button topic, which has dominated politics, the news, media, secularism. So, what is secularism? Why is it such a heated topic in India? And why are some people against secularism? And some people are saying that one party is being accused of pseudo secularism, while other party says we want the true secularism. And I will be asking why we need secularism at all, whether it's the pseudo variety or even the real variety. Why do we need it? So that I'll be examining it more. I'll examine the European roots of the whole secular state model. Does it really apply it in the Indian context? That. Next, I get into my own research, which I've been working on the past 7 years, the Dravidian movement. It's the political roots, the intellectual roots of its movement, and how even that has long Western intellectual uh, history behind it. It goes back many centuries. So I unravel that, the roots of the Dravidian movement, and what I discovered when studying one of the scholars, intellectuals who started this whole Dravidian movement. So I will get into that. And then finally, I get into the topic of rituals, rituals, mantras, their role in Indian culture. Professor Balu, in his book, The Heathen in His Blindness, uh, he says that rituals form the foundation of Indian culture. It is the basis out of which all the other aspects of culture grew, like our devatas, our philosophies, our festivals, everything, even our concept of morality, dharma, this grew from ritual. So I will be using the research of both Professor Balu and this German researcher called Fritz Stahl, who has done very brilliant, very exciting work on rituals. I think I've shared his text with you in the syllabus. Rituals and mantras. It's called Rules Without Meaning. That is what it's called. We will explore that further. And Professor Balu says that rituals are not only the basis of Indian culture, they're also the basis of Western, Asian culture as a whole. So even China, India. So there is such a thing called Asian culture, like India, Japan, China. We share common roots. I mean, you can say China, India, geopolitically they are enemies, they are having fights, but culturally we have long roots. We share thousands of years of a common cultural heritage, and it's worth it. It's very interesting to explore such a heritage. So that's about it from my summary. If anyone has questions, any comments, questions will be welcome. I will look at. There's been a comment in the Q&A. I will look at that. Ah, yes. So Nidhi, this thing, Nidhi Shendrunikar, she has asked a question. Yeah, this thing. Are Orientalism and Indology connected? Yes. Indology is basically the Indian version of Orientalism. That's it. So Orientalism about India, the Western descriptions of India are both Orientalism and Indology. So Orientalism about India is Indology. That's it. That's it. And
There was a
yes,
there was one more query from Abhijit Das ji, Arvind ji. He asked a question, and while you were presenting, I told him that we will ask this question at the end of the session if there is time. But I also recommended to him that the question that he's asked is interesting, and perhaps enrolling into the program and going through the entire exercise might help him get an answer in a more meaningful manner. But however, his question is there an example where such research in cultures, Indian versus Western, has produced an actionable output that has influenced perceptible change rather than just remain in the knowledge warehouses? I'm looking at this from the lens of it being useful. This is in the answered questions, if you wish to read it again, by Abhijit.
okay, okay. Ah, let me see it. Let me see. I'm just
Yeah.
looking
So,
through the question. Yeah.
yeah. And perhaps you could stop sharing the screen now that the
Yeah, yeah. I'll stop sharing. One sec.
okay.
There.
So the
So,
question by Abhijit Das ji in the answered Q&A, probably you might want to look at it.
so is the kind of research has produced actionable output and perceptible change? I mean, it depends on this thing. What do you mean by actionable output and perceptible change? I mean, these perceptible change, I mean, now Professor Balu is pretty well known now, but that is both can be a curse and a blessing because a lot of people also misunderstand what he's saying also. His research has now become well known, like in scholarly circles and even in people outside scholarly circles in many of the Indic circles, they also pretty much have heard of Professor Balu and his research, and people are now starting to question like what the West has written about us, and that inferiority complex is slowly starting to disappear. So but it's hard to know what this research program, it's very difficult to get whether that is how much of it is due to this research program, how much of it is this thing. So it useful in the sense, yes, it's useful. It definitely gives us knowledge. Knowledge is always useful. If you can access our culture, it will be very useful. Whether you can see it as a affect a society-wide change, that is very difficult to answer, and that will take a lot of time. This is a very new research program. I mean, it's the 30. It started in the 90s, and which is pretty new for a research program. It's pretty new, so it will take many more decades. This thing. What we hope is that this research program becomes a template for social science research. In order for it to have an impact, I would say that there needs to be a very stark educational reform in higher education. Government needs to invest in social science research and serious research, not just ideology, not just right wing fighting with left wing. That is
You
not
mean
useful in the long run.
academic
Yeah.
research instead of, yeah, academic research is what you mean.
Yeah. So that there needs to be an investment. So I hope that answers your question.
But I would like to re-emphasize that perhaps I think the duration of this course that we have envisioned for Arvindji's course, which begins in October, it's still small, but it is a beginning. And going forward, we might come up with an intermediate or advanced level. But I would highly recommend folks who have attended to this, and because I just loved what all you shared with us, Arvindji. A lot of things sometimes are very self-evident, but when presented in this manner, it gives you so much of food for reflection. There's one query by Nidhi ji again. She says, which of the concepts being taught in the course can be used directly in the classroom with undergraduate and postgraduate students? I'm guessing all, but you could answer it.
Yeah, this everything could be used. I mean, all this material can be catered, adjusted to different age levels. In fact, I'm teaching it to some high school students. They're like 16, 17. I just put it in a more simple language so they can understand it, 16, 17 years old. But this can be used all the way from this thing, from high school up to postgraduate level. And even us as researchers, even beyond postgraduate, these are still some questions we are trying to still understand fully, even me trying to understand, and we are still trying to get a grip of it. So absolutely.
So there's a query by Toshi ji.
Yeah, one second. ah when we access Toshiji, when we access our scriptures through English, do we not get the actual picture of Indic concepts? Could you please give an example? So, for example, when you're reading this thing, when you translate Atman as soul, you don't get the picture, because soul, if you actually read Christian theory, soul means a completely different from Atman, and you might say that, okay, but I don't care about Christian theory. I can still understand that the soul means Atman, but the concept gets smuggled in because we use things like may his soul rest in peace. Even Indians use that concept. How can there's no such thing as his soul? See, already the concept of Atman gets distorted. There's no multiple Atmans. So when you start using soul, you start thinking of each person having his own Atman, and that gets reborn into another body. So so then that is the Atman itself gets distorted, because in our scripture there's only one Atman, which there's no multiple Atmans. And there's no question of the soul resting in peace, because the soul is always in peace, nothing is changed. So as I said, so those Christian theology gets smuggled in as we read, as we start using English terms, it becomes unavoidable. So that's all. I hope that answers the question. It won't fully answer it, but I hope that's a start to
Uh,
begin.
in fact, we are already about to reach 8 p.m. IST. So I think we will have to put a hard stop. Having said that, a recording of this session will be shared with everybody who registered for today's pre-webinar. And if you have any queries after watching the videos, please feel free to email us at reachout@indica.courses. However, I'm sure that today's session would have given you a brief inkling of what to expect. We curate such courses because we find that there's a dearth of it in the mainstream academia at present in India. And we also ensure that the participants come from a wide range. Like we could have homemakers who are interested in research. We could have children from higher education institutions, professionals who are not into Indology but still curious about their civilization, or into the social science theories. And also these programs are a step in that direction. So when Arvindji said that, there's a need, there is also a need for these frameworks to be known among the masses, so that people can get curiouser and curiouser, and that could also get researchers interested in these fields. So the courses that we curate are meant to encourage people to step into this. This is a long journey, as Arvindji just said, that we just began in the 90s and it's too short a period. But this is just to invite people, if there is no such formal structure at present, we want to do that for you. So I really urge you, watch this recording, and if it interests you, please enroll into the program. And more importantly, if there is any researcher, scholar, or somebody else who you feel might benefit from participating in the program, please do recommend it to them. Having said that, it's already 8:01 p.m. I would really like to thank more than 100 people who registered for this webinar. I hope to see at least a third of them enroll into the course. And I definitely would want you to write to us should you have any queries about this session, about the course, at reachout@indica.courses. We also have scholarships and grants to offer, as you know, and I keep repeating it in every webinar. So please do not hesitate to write to us. We are always there to support genuine seekers and learners who might wish to avail of any such, scholarships and other such promotional offers. Happy to help. So with that, I think we will stop today's session. Arvindji,
Thank
thank
you
you
very much, everybody. And thank you, Dimple ji.
so
Thank you very
much.
much.
And
Mm.
we will see you all soon in the next edition of our weekend webinars very soon. Till then, namaste. Bye-bye.
Namaste. Namaste.